Okay, so I got the request from Avishai to do the lecture, and I was thinking, what can I do about? I haven't had many psychedelic experiences, so my expertise in that field is not very strong. But almost 2 years ago, I finished my BA in philosophy and Middle Eastern studies, and since the group deals a lot with philosophy, I thought of doing some sort of an introduction to metaphysics. I didn't know what's the level of the group and what's the difference between the knowledge of different people, and I'm sure that there are some things that I'm going to discuss that are very known to some of you, but I wanted to maybe give common terms and common language that could be discussed when talking about psychedelic experiences. So in brief, I'm going to discuss, sorry if the text is a bit small on some slides, but I'm going to discuss metaphysics, and inside that ontology, which are big philosophical terms which relate a lot to how we experience and describe the world. I'm going to discuss main ontological positions, which are different positions and philosophical views on how to see and describe the world. I'm going to discuss a bit how psychedelics and metaphysics could be related, and I found an interesting study that studied exactly that from 2 years ago. And to me, as a philosophy student, I wasn't very interested in metaphysics when I started taking philosophy, and as a BA graduate, I even more despise metaphysics than when I started. It's not my field of philosophy. I hate talking about abstract things, and I'm going to talk a bit about how maybe philosophy complicates stuff, sometimes maybe too much, and about how maybe there are more important questions to ask than maybe philosophical questions. So it's sort of a mix between an intro to philosophy and my experience with the evolution of ideas within my head during my studies. So I'm going to start with the definitions, and you can ask the questions because now's the time when you don't understand something. So metaphysics is a main branch of philosophy that deals with fundamental nature of reality. That's the branch of philosophy that asks the question of how time works, what exists in reality, what is identity when we say that something is identical to another, or what is a property, what is the color red, what it means to say that there is causality in the universe, or determinism. Other branches of philosophy are ethics or logic. For example, logic would study how arguments work and what is a valid argument. And ethics would ask questions such as what is a good life, or what is a good action. And within metaphysics, we have the specific branch that deals with what exists in nature, which is ontology. I don't remember the Greek word for that, but ontos I think is being or something like that. And so when you say ontology, you ask what is maybe the fundamental thing that constitutes reality, if it is one thing or two things that together make reality. For example, maybe I'll get to that, but the usual scientific way to describe the world is that it's made of tiny particles, and between them you have vacuum, and vacuum is not particles, and so you have essentially two type of things that assemble the universe. I'm sure that physicists would disagree on what I'm talking about, but that's our intuition on the physical way to describe the world.
Can can you emphasize, because it sounded like what you just said about ontology is what I know as metaphysics. Can you clarify a bit what the different, like what metaphysics is that isn't ontology? What?
Yeah, so I like, it's the bottom of the slide, like ontology is a specific set of questions within metaphysics, and like going above it, other metaphysical inquiries would deal, for example, with the question, are there laws of nature? Which aren't, like, it could be ontological in a sense, but like you ask if there is a law of nature and how to describe it, or if there is causality, and like you can have a specific ontological view that the world is physical, and from that you can have the claim that there are laws of nature, and you can argue that there aren't laws of nature, and like it's different from arguing whether they apply to a physical world or another world. And so like talking about ontological views, the two main ontological views, and like the most common ones are physicalism or materialism and idealism. Materialism or physicalism, they're almost like identical terms, and like in philosophy people always try to لخدد, like to be more precise with their arguments, and like here I'm not trying to be very precise, like I'm sure that there are 1,000 different philosophers with like different specific views, and I'm like trying to give the broad terms. And so like materialism would argue that something physical, like matter, is the like ultimate foundation of reality. Like when you dig deeper and like you split something and you split it again, it's made out of matter, like something concrete and physical is there. Like for example, John Locke is a very prominent materialist philosopher, and he argued like that the world is made out of tiny balls, like without any specific properties, but like when we see them, they are combined in different like molecules and like arrangements that make them appear to us as having colors or shape or textures. Like a physicalist wouldn't necessarily argue that there isn't like consciousness, for example, but it would argue that consciousness is like based on a physical foundation. For example, neuroscientists would often say that our brain produces consciousness, but like at the bottom of this, it's ultimately electricity, for example, and electricity is Newtonian. What's the word? Electronium.
Yeah, electrons.
Yeah. Idealism is the opposite, in a sense, of materialism, and it's sometimes not very easy to grasp at first sight, but at the same time, it sometimes makes more sense than materialism. And like idealism, it's not in the sense that something is ideal, like perfect, like in the sense of idea more. It was promptly the main philosopher who argued for that position is Berkeley, which was like a philosopher priest, also like a main philosophical figure, and he argued that the world is ultimately mental, like mental in the sense that consciousness or some mental property, spiritual, the mind is like what constitutes reality. And like Berkeley got to that position since like what we have available to us is our mind. And so like when he asked if we have available to us only our mind, so the world is at least made out of that, and he said something that is physical in our intuition couldn't possibly affect something that is mental or spiritual, because a physical thing and spiritual thing couldn't like interact in any sense because they are different types of things in the universe. And so he argued that our mind is affected by things, and so they couldn't be physical, so they have to be spiritual. And like I'm really making the argument very broad, obviously, but and so like his conclusion was that the world is made out of our mind, but then like from that he had a religious point of view that sort of made it into a collective mind that accounts for how there are different people in the universe and they all share like the same reality. And so you can have different types of how you can be an idealist. Like you can claim that the world only exists in your mind, or like there are physical things, but like the main foundation of them is spiritual or mental. And again, like as I say in the slide, like certain philosophers from each position could concede that there are things or items in the universe that have the properties of seeming contradictory to their claim. Like every idealist will claim that you can touch things, but they would say that touching things is like a mental representation within your mind. It's not like physical in the way that materialists claim that the world is. And ultimately they would get to a statement that emotions or senses are mental, like in the term that is defined as a spiritual or something that exists in your consciousness and not like in a physical world. And of course you have like the claim that the world is, you have dualism, which would argue that the world is both. Like you have the physical world and the spiritual world, and they interact with one another, sort of like Airbender or something. Like you have both worlds and there's some sort of connection between them. Descartes was like a prominent dualist, but there are other ways to interpret him as well. So that's like the basic main conceptions of philosophy.
But it as a structure of timeline, like before there was consciousness, there was physical reality, and after that was consciousness, or they are both at the same time from the beginning, or?
So I'm not sure with like Greek philosophy. I can't like give you a good account of how like the Greeks thought about this. I think that like some Greeks invented, like who's that, Thales, who invented like the atoms and came up with them. Maybe it wasn't Thales.
No.
What is his name?
His name something with around atom. Wasn't it?
No, I don't
No,
think so. Because
That
that
is
is
because
everything is
if
mind.
fundamentally, like reality was
No, but everything is
physical,
mind.
and after that
Everything is
was
spirit.
also
like as a timeline in philosophy.
In that
in
specific
dualism.
yeah.
So like I think the question is in dualism, and correct me if I'm wrong. Like is the claim like, and it might be different from between different sects of dualism, but like was there first like a physical reality and then from there you got
Okay. So you have two I think main dualist claims. One would argue that consciousness is in a sense constituted by physical events, and that would be maybe the classical scientific claim today that like consciousness doesn't exist within an electron, but get enough electrons and enough neurons in a brain and consciousness is made. And so like the spiritual or the mind are constituted by physical things in a sense. But you have like other philosophers which would claim that it isn't possible to create something spiritual from something physical, and so that they would argue that you need to have like a basic spiritual atom to the universe. Like you have the physical atoms and you have the spiritual or mental atoms, and they both like live in the same world or like in same dimensions to the world. You can also have like a dualist stance which would argue that you have both universes in a sense, and they interact with one another, and we experience like our mental world, and you have the physical world, and we experience some sort of an interaction between them. And so like you would have different positions within each theory. What got me sort of like agitated or like angry even during my philosophy studies was that both of these positions sounded very logical. Like I could identify myself with each in a sense, and this is what like I found most annoying with metaphysics, is that like the arguments within metaphysics can sometimes be very abstract, and like I couldn't get, if you don't have in a sense like the same grounds as the philosopher who is arguing your the counter argument, like you wouldn't agree with them ever. Like if you have someone that originates from a scientific point of view, and you're not a scientific person, like you wouldn't necessarily be following their same logic and get to a physicalist point of view. And like to me, when I studied them, I started like a physicalist, but idealism also sounded very correct, and I couldn't like get my grasp on what was incorrect with idealism, and I couldn't find myself dancing between those two point of views. And I'll get to that, like eventually I get to a conclusion that it doesn't necessarily really matter, but like at the time it was very annoying. And like taking psychedelics, and if I connect it to psychedelics a bit, I heard several people say that like taking psychedelics was like distancing them from a materialist point of view and maybe connecting them more to an idealist point of view. And so I like tried to Google like psychedelics and metaphysics, and like surprisingly, like 2 years ago there was a study that studied like people, they gave them like a questionnaire of like your philosophical positions, and they tried to classify them between like idealists, physicalists, dualists, or people who didn't have like one of those main positions. And they gave them psilocybin, and I can't remember what the other ones was. And then they checked what was happening to them 4 weeks and 6 months into like taking psychedelics, and they saw like a slight shift of people moving from being materialists or physicalists into being more idealists, or and yeah, the term that they used here is panpsychism.
Can you show the graph where we can see it?
Like do a zoom in. Yeah, that's like I think that one was the interesting. It's like non-physicalist beliefs, and like you can have people using it over time, and like over time they had like an increase of people with like non-physicalists point of view, and like you have correlation with lifetime psychedelic use, and you see that materialism and naturalism, which is like saying that the world is only natural, like have a negative correlation, and the other philosophical views, which are ultimately or dualist or like other non-physicalist positions, have more positive correlation with using psychedelics like long term, and that would be also like the
Maybe you define naturalism for this.
Naturalism. It's sort of like physicalism or materialism. I'm sure like people who hold these positions have more like better definitions, but it's saying that the world is only what is natural and nothing spiritual. And so like it would be close to physicalism or
It's Darwinism in a sense. So like it's more of like an evolutionary kind of way of looking at things, like how nature unfolds.
Yeah,
so we're like natural beings because we're like
but like I think the trouble is defining like what is nature exactly. So I'm like not a very big into understanding that like that position specifically. Like here they used the panpsychism, which is very close to being an idealist. It's like arguing that the whole world, like pan, is in a sense your psyche, like psychism. It's like in a sense like the Spinozist view that the world is like your mind, and in a sense it's like idealism.
I always confused. There's like panpsychism and panpsychism or something like
But
that.
like the
like
thing
that's,
is with
like-
philosophical point of views is like they have different terms to sometimes very close.
No, so one of them
positions.
means like that the stone is in some way conscious, and
Ah.
another one means that like
Hmm.
we are
So
like,
I think that one could also panpsychism could argue. I think that physical things have spiritual properties.
because then I don't think the idealist would say that the
Yeah.
stone is conscious. It just
Yeah, it would say that there isn't like a physical stone, in a
it's
sense.
like you see it, but it's like
Yeah.
it's not.
And so that was interesting to me, like knowing that there is some sort of a correlation between like your metaphysical point of view and like psychedelic experiences, which is like very interesting. But like studying philosophy and like growing tired of the endless fightings between which like ontological point of view is like the best, you have some sort of an escape from it, which is phenomenology. And like phenomenology is like a new and a different way to study philosophy, which focuses way more on the phenomenon, like on the way you experience the world and the study of our experience. And in a sense, when you study your mind, you are not committed to an ontological position. Like, I only study my mind. I'm not committed like if there is a glass or there isn't a glass. Like, I only know how I experience
So it's
the
not
glass.
ontological in a sense.
Yeah, it's like a different questions.
Alright,
It's
so
only like how I
so
experience the glass.
meditation is very correlated.
Yeah,
with
it's
that,
very
alright.
different. It's very close to that. Kant also had like a very close position to that, and he argued that since we are only available to our mind, we can't even determine if the glass actually exists or not, or like what are its properties. We are only available to our consciousness, in a sense. And for me, like a different escape was simplicity. And since I don't have a lot of time, maybe I won't like get into that a lot. But David Hume, who is a very famous philosopher, at the end of the chapter of his like very famous book, treatise on human nature, he said that like when he gets into all these complexities of reason and paradoxes, he chooses to dine, play a game, backgammon, and like not deal with philosophy in a sense. He like escapes the philosophical problems. And to me, over time, I, in a sense, decided that what I find more interesting is like issues of ethics or social criticism, which like have more relevance to me, at least, like to our way of experiencing the world and like making it a better place. And like in my view, psychedelics could help first like in increasing creativity in like the process of creating solutions to bettering our society, and also like I encountered like a specific field of research which deals with ethics and biology, and like studies the attempts to better our moral views with psychedelics or like biology in general. And like one research which I found like said that subjects are also reported and community observers collaborated that the result of the psilocybin experience, they experienced lasting positive changes in outlook and behavior, including altruistic or positive social effects. And it's also like, in my eyes, a very interesting thing to study if psychedelics also can change your ethical point of view and not only like your metaphysical or ontological point of view. And that's like the main talk.
Whoa! Amazing. So many questions.
Yeah, like I want to say, like I deeply get your point because, first of all, I think it's a crucial thing as a human to pass the experience of learning the differences behind those points of view, not to neglect it at all. First, have the complex issue of dealing with all the complexities that you showed, and then realizing, all right, I can't get to one conclusion because all of them are seeing they're all making sense to me.
Yeah.
And if I will be attached to one of them deeply, it will probably means that I'm biased in some way, and I can't actually tell it as a fact which one is correct. They all seem right. So okay, so I will now I have the freedom to deal with the things about ethics and things like that, because I've managed to pass this phase of my life that I really dive deep into that and realized that I wouldn't have the answer. Now I can let it go.
Yeah, I think that metaphysical questions are there are people who aren't interested in them at all, but I think that people with some philosophical tendency usually ask themselves questions of that sort and want to get to answers within them. And I think that the process of learning and getting to something that you're comfortable with usually takes up learning and getting deep into several things, in I think everything you study. And so to me, maybe I can say I can neglect maybe metaphysical questions, but only because I went through different point of views, studied them and got to a position which I feel comfortable with, and maybe saying my mind is limited, I can't say for sure what occurs in the real world. That's my philosophical point of view. It's maybe not an objective absolute point of view, but that's my personal solution. It's enough for me to move to other different problems which are in my eyes more relevant for society maybe.
So, what I find, I got to a similar conclusion in a very different topic, which is that, I had the same sort of questions, okay, if I choose to adopt this point of view, then what I see makes sense from this point of view. But if I choose to adopt the opposite point of view, what I see still makes sense from that opposite point of view, but it's not just metaphysically, but also in everyday politics, self-esteem, stuff like that. And to me, that's something I'm still struggling with for 10 years almost. What do you do at that point? Because it works for metaphysics because it's abstract, but in a sense, a lot of the stuff that actually matters in real life is completely abstract. It's several levels beyond the physical, and there's several levels of interpretation that allow you enough leeway to sort of make sense of anything.
But these are the most abstract.
Yes, but the problem still remains at things that we would definitely say are relevant, like ethics, like politics, stuff like that, and at that point saying, okay, well, I just, I withhold judgment is more problematic as a position to take. First of all, is that a similar experience to? Do you have that experience, and if so, how do you deal with it?
Yeah, studying ethics was, I think, more difficult in that sense because you can have, the relativist point of view with everyone has their own morality, and you have reasons to believe that it is the case, but then you have paradoxes and logical issues with being a relativist when you can't come to terms with how to decide on a question which involves people with different moral positions. like that's a relevant like example for the question. So yeah, I think that withholding judgment is probably a worse solution for those. And I think that also in the example of metaphysics, it's not necessarily withholding judgment, but it's like getting to the close enough answer which like satisfies my need to like move on and get to other things. So maybe we can do the same with like ethics. Maybe we can for ourselves get to a point which is good enough, but maybe the problem with ethics is like you have all the real world problems which occur from ethics, and then like maybe the good enough would be very difficult to get to, and I'm not sure if we have those. Like I can give my account of like my ethical point of view, but like I don't think it would necessarily answer the question.
I have a question. Personally, you've had experience with psychedelics. Did your metaphysical or philosophical position change as a result?
So yeah, I think that it's something weird. Like in a sense, my first intuition was okay. I was very connected to like my consciousness, and so I wanted to say that it's being more like getting me somewhere more idealist, but at the same time the intuition was I ate something which was physical and it got me to do all that, and it like triggered maybe dualist intuitions, but I came to doing psychedelics, like my standpoint was mainly phenomenological. Like I withheld judgment from like how the world really is universally or absolutely, and like only studied my consciousness in relation to that. And so I think that the knowledge that the universe could be very different from my point of view, I think maybe like fundamentally my position is dualist, and like I think psychedelics in a sense encouraged that point of view, because like it's difficult for me to say that there isn't like an objective world in a sense, but I'm very committed to the claim that my experience of the world is not the world as it is, but like some interpretation of that. And I think that what psychedelics got me thinking was that it got me, it twisted like the way that I interpret the objective reality, and like in a different sense. Like when you put on sunglasses, the world looks darker. When you put psilocybin, the world looks brighter. I don't know. So like there is some sort of an interaction, I think.
That's so interesting. And I thought I'm having now, as you're speaking and doing your talk, is like to utilize like psychedelics as another tool of doing philosophy, because up until now we had logic, right, to come from premises to conclusions, and we had like empirical, tools of science to get into knowledge through, repeated experiments. But this is a very interesting tool, but it's just available basically now, and I'm just thinking how it's such an unexplored territory. Right?
So
like,
many shamans would just want to hit your face.
no, they've exploded, but it's a vast, infinite of different states of consciousness and different states of understanding the world as it is. And I wonder if it's another tool in the arsenal of the philosopher. Like you can think things out, like logically, get to them. You can, gather evidence and make sure the scientific community thinks it's not bullshit. But there's a third tool, which is like the psychedelic or experience, which is I think it's a different. Do you think it's a different category, or do you think that you can break it down to
So
these other two?
I think that ultimately, like your philosophical point of view and like the way you see the world, it is never fully like logical. I think that if you take all the propositions that I believe in and you put them all out, I'm sure that there are contradictions. I'm sure that there have been contradictions in what I was saying, like during the talk. And I think that human beings, like in essence, can't hold like a completely logical point of view. But I think that emotions and experience are very intertwined with our point of view. Like probably someone who grew up in a religious household, for example, would have very strong anti-physicalist ideas, because like when you believe in God, you can't think that the world is only made out of matter. Like it doesn't even get together like logically. And so I think for example is that when you have a materialist point of view, you sometimes do it because you are very pessimistic in a sense, or like maybe it's even a chicken and the egg. Like when you have a materialist point of view, you're also like more depressed because like nothing has any meaning. But I think that a lot of people, and the research that I showed before, showed that a lot of people who did like psychedelics moved from materialist point of views to other point of views, and they also like found it correlated with their like well-being. And like in a sense, maybe the way you interact with the world changes how you perceive the world. And so like in a sense, your metaphysical point of view is not very logical, like it's deeply connected to how you interact with the world. And that, for example, could explain why people who do psychedelics are generally more happy and like are generally less materialist, because maybe there's something into interaction between all of these elements of experience.
Super interesting. And do you think again, like you can use mushrooms, let's say, or LSD, or any of those to get into something which is true, like your personal intuition? Do you think that like it's another tool in the we can use? It's like, and once you finish an experience, like you meet God or his angels or whatever, do you think there's something true about that experience, or do you think it's a delusion of some sort?
Interesting. My way of maybe seeing psychedelics from like the few experience that I've had was in a sense also the element of neuroplasticity which occurs in psychedelics, and maybe doing psychedelics could get you more creative and like sharpening your thoughts in a sense. So maybe even not the spiritual elements of psychedelics, but even also the ability to grasp, like to maybe get a lot of ideas together at the same time, and combining them with your experience, with your immediate experience, that in a sense could maybe sharpen the way you see the world, like as a tool to think maybe. And I'm sure that the spiritual element could add something, because when you have more data, for example, if to speak as a scientist, like I'm sure that when you have more experiences, like you have a fuller theory. But I'm not like sure how to connect spirituality and the things which don't occur under psychedelic experience, and how to like translate them into day-to-day life. Like when you see angels or aliens, I'm not sure exactly. Like it's interesting how you can translate it into a normal like.
I'm personally really interested in looking at it through the. So I'm really interested in where metaphysics. You don't have to take a. Where metaphysics meets mystical experiences and psychedelic experiences, and because they're like very similar in certain regards. Because when you read like certain metaphysical analytical philosophical treatises, and you're like, okay, he's talking about everything is mind, we're in the mind of God, and reality, and then like the mystics go in and they kind of describe something really similar, but then it's like more of a experiential thing. They're actually having that experience. They're really realizing that in a sense.
Yeah.
And like metaphysics, they go off in like polar opposite ways.
Yeah.
And then you've got like the psychedelic experience, which is part like sometimes really mystical and then really converges on the metaphysical, and you can see it when like people just like metaphysics change, like the psychological folk model of the world they have changed with that experience. And I'm really curious to find out whether or not people can actually if maybe the psychedelic experience is just like this gate towards the mystical experiences that could be the actual foundation of proper metaphysics, ones that are phenomenological. Yeah, thank you. In nature, and not like and not what the hell analytical philosophy is doing, which is just
So
horrible.
it leads to the question: what is exactly spiritual or mystical in the psychedelic experience? And one would argue, if we need to make it as a metaphor, that maybe you have a lot of elements in the psychedelic experience that one of them is like, let's take an analogy for like a music mixer with a lot of knobs of volume, and every knob of volume represents a certain quality of the psychedelic experience. As if you take, and it's endless. You take that knob, and that knob will create some kind of hallucinogens and some kind of visuals, and this one will make this kind of effect, and this one this kind of effect. So I don't remember where I heard this analogy, but like you have a lot of like characteristics or whatever on the board, and you have a giant knob in the middle of, like, I would say, consciousness. What is the main knob of consciousness is like the big question, but let's say all the other stuff is like side effects or really cool things that take our attention, and like all the visual stuff and all the aliens and all the whatever, and these are the little knobs. And let's address the big knob. What is that consciousness boost that everybody talks about when they taking and talking about psychedelics? Because like it's one thing to do 2 grams of mushrooms and have fun, and it's other thing to like do a big bang of 5-MeO DMT and like come after that and say like, okay, I get it. Like it's something totally different.
I get the universe, yeah.
No one says they get it after 5-MeO. They say, what?
I don't get it at all.
It starts with what, and then all right, I realize it. Like I didn't did 5-MeO myself, but everybody that talks about 5-MeO or there is a 5-MeO malt, even that is kind of anyway, they are like, all right, I did DMT before, like not the 5-MeO, and there was a lot of the little knobs about aliens and corals and all of that small knob stuff, but in 5-MeO, only the big consciousness knob was raised like to 100. So the question of what is the big knob of consciousness is, I think, the most deep questions about psychedelics and about like the ontological question that we can ask about that specific thing.
What is it, or can you get there? Because
like
you think you could get an answer for what is it?
Like what is it? We the type of answer that we could get is we could all agree that the answer is not verbal. like it's experiential in a sense that,
Yeah.
like what you said about psychedelics, can you get another kind of knowledge, and that another kind of knowledge is must be not verbal knowledge. It must be an intuitional knowledge and experiential knowledge.
Okay.
So what is that experiential knowledge? Can we make out it, like, can we translate it into words? I think we cannot yet, and maybe will never be. But what is it doesn't mean that I want the answer in a written form. Like I want the answer in a broad way.
Yes,
So
Alon.
I think
Easy question.
so I obviously don't have an answer to what consciousness is, but like I think you got to a very like interesting truth about maybe a distinction that Omri also maybe made between people who are more interested in philosophy and people who are maybe more interested in the mind or meditation or phenomenology, which is like people who do meditation would be very convenient with getting to an answer which isn't written down. And like philosophers wouldn't ever be satisfied with something that they can't like write down in an essay, in a book, in some written, very clear verbal, like communicative sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like in a sense, philosophy.
Propositional sense. In a propositional sense.
Yeah, propositional and also like communicative. Like I'm communicating my ideas and like spreading them down. And like in meditation, you get to truths about your consciousness, but in essence, like you can't describe them because you understand that there's like a gap between them. And I'm sure that there are also tons of philosophers who would agree that what they are writing down is different from like what they are experiencing, but like in a sense the bindings of doing philosophy and the bindings of discussing your ideas with other people like requires you to write them down as clearly and specifically as you can. And maybe they are like different projects, but maybe they could like come together. Like, I'm sure you can do a whole lot of meditation and psychedelics and at the same time trying to communicate your ideas to other people. But maybe it's interesting that also like